In the winter of 1879, when authorities finally opened the graves behind St. Stephen's Church in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, they discovered something that would haunt the coal region for generations. Of the 157 coffins buried over 12 years, not a single one contained human remains. Instead, each coffin held carefully arranged stones, weighted to match the supposed deceased, while church records showed insurance payouts totaling over $300,000, an astronomical sum for that era. What happened to those 157 souls who supposedly died peacefully in their beds? The truth would prove far more sinister than anyone could have imagined, revealing a web of deception that reached from the church pulpit to the darkest minds of Pennsylvania. Tonight, for the first time, we'll uncover the complete truth about Reverend Marcus Thompson and the conspiracy that turned a house of God into a marketplace for human lives. Before we continue with the story of Reverend Thompson and the mysterious graves of St. Stephen's Church, I want to ask you something. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of American history. If you're ready to hear stories that others dare not tell, stories that will make you question what really happened in the shadows of our past, then subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, from which state are you listening to this story? Leave a comment below telling us your location. Now let's discover what really happened in those Pennsylvania coal fields over a century ago. The truth about St. Stephen's Church begins in a place where desperation and faith collided in the most tragic way possible. Millbrook, Pennsylvania in 1867 was a town built on coal dust and broken dreams. Nestled in the Schuylkill County Valley, it housed nearly 3,000 souls, most of them Welsh and Irish immigrants who'd come seeking prosperity in America's booming coal industry. The town's heart beat to the rhythm of the mines, the pre-dawn whistle that called men to their darkness, the evening bell that welcomed them home, and too often the funeral bells that marked another life claimed by cave-ins, explosions, or the black lung that slowly strangled miners from within. St. Stephen's Episcopal Church stood on Elm Street, its modest brick facade and simple wooden steeple a stark contrast to the elaborate Catholic cathedral across town. The church served the Protestant community, primarily English and German families who'd arrived in earlier waves of immigration. Unlike their Catholic neighbors, the Protestant miners often lacked the strong community networks that helped families survive tragedy. When breadwinners died, Protestant widows frequently found themselves alone, with limited support from both their congregation and the broader community. This isolation would prove crucial to what was about to unfold. Reverend Marcus Thompson had arrived in Millbrook in early 1867, a tall, silver-haired man of 45 with pale blue eyes and a voice that could bring comfort to the grieving or fire to the faithful. He came with impeccable credentials, ordained in Philadelphia, previously served congregations in Harrisburg and Allentown, letters of recommendation from prominent Episcopal bishops. His wife, Catherine, was a refined woman who quickly organized church social events and visited the sick with appropriate Methodist devotion. Thompson's arrival couldn't have been more perfectly timed. The previous rector, Reverend William Hayes, had died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving the congregation without spiritual guidance during one of the deadliest periods in the mine's history. In Thompson's first 6 months, he conducted 14 funerals, more than Hayes had performed in his last 2 years combined. But Thompson brought more than spiritual comfort. He introduced something revolutionary to St. Stephen's, a church-sponsored life insurance program. "My dear brothers and sisters," Thompson announced from the pulpit on a crisp October Sunday in 1867, his voice carrying the authority of divine mission, "I have seen too much suffering in our community. Too many widows left destitute. Too many children orphaned, not just of fathers, but of any hope for their future. The Lord calls us to prepare for tomorrow, not merely pray for it. The insurance program was simple and appealing. Church members could purchase life insurance policies through a company Thompson had partnered with, Keystone Mutual Assurance of Philadelphia. The premiums were remarkably affordable, especially compared to other insurance companies that viewed coal mining as too risky. A miner could insure his life for $500, nearly 2 years' wages, for just 50 cents per month. Widows would receive immediate payment upon presentation of a death certificate. No questions asked, no lengthy investigations. Within 6 months, over 200 families had enrolled. What made Thompson's program particularly attractive was his personal attention to bereaved families. Unlike other insurance companies that required extensive documentation and often delayed payments for months, Thompson personally guaranteed that families would receive their benefits within days of burial. He would handle all the paperwork, coordinate with the insurance company, and even advance money from church funds if necessary to ensure no family suffered while waiting for their rightful compensation. Dr. Cornelius Whitman, who had recently established his practice in Millbrook, became another key figure in this arrangement. A graduate of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, Whitman was young, ambitious, and eager to build his reputation in the community. He worked closely with Thompson, often waiving his fees for examining the deceased and providing death certificates for church members. This Christian charity, as Thompson called it, was another blessing the Reverend had brought to their community. Samuel Crow, the town's undertaker and sexton of St. Stephen's Cemetery, completed what seemed like a perfectly coordinated support system for grieving families. Crow, a somber man of 50 with prematurely white hair and hands permanently stained by his trade, had been serving Millbrook for 15 years. He offered payment plans for funerals, often accepting delayed payment until insurance benefits arrived. His prices were fair, his service dignified, and his discretion absolute. This trinity of care, spiritual, medical, and practical, made St. Stephen's Church a beacon of hope in a community where death was a constant companion. Families felt protected, knowing that their loved ones would be properly cared for in death and that survivors would be provided for. The arrangement seemed like a godsend, and perhaps that was exactly how it was designed to appear. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on a bitter February morning in 1868, though it would be 11 years before anyone understood its significance. Thomas McKenna had been walking to his shift at the Millbrook mine when he spotted a familiar figure trudging along the railroad tracks that led out of town. The man was thin, dressed in rough work clothes, and walked with a peculiar limp that McKenna recognized. Immediately, it was James Morrison, a fellow miner and member of St. Stephen's Church. The problem was, McKenna had attended Morrison's funeral just 3 weeks earlier. McKenna called out, but the distant figure didn't respond. By the time McKenna reached the spot where he'd seen the man, the tracks were empty. The early morning mist rising from the coal tipple made visibility poor, and McKenna convinced himself he'd been mistaken. Grief and guilt could play tricks on a man's mind. He knew that from experience. Morrison had died in a mine accident, crushed by a falling support beam. McKenna had been working the same shaft and had blamed himself for not warning his friend quickly enough. So McKenna said nothing. What could he say? That he'd seen a dead man walking the railroad tracks? People would think the coal dust had finally addled his brain. But Thomas McKenna wasn't the only one experiencing such encounters. Over the following months, other residents reported similar sightings. Mary O'Sullivan swore she saw her deceased husband Patrick buying supplies at a general store in the neighboring town of Centralia. Agnes Fletcher claimed her late son Benjamin had appeared at her kitchen window one evening, thinner than she remembered but unmistakably alive. Each sighting was dismissed by the witness themselves, tricks of light, figments of grief-stricken imagination, cases of mistaken identity. The reports shared disturbing similarities. The ghosts were always seen at a distance, always in neighboring towns, and always appeared thinner and more haggard than remembered. They never responded to calls, never approached their former neighbors, and seemed to vanish when pursued. Reverend Thompson, when consulted about these visions, provided comfort with theological explanation. Grief manifests in mysterious ways, he counseled from the pulpit. The mind, in its desperate need to hold on to what is lost, sometimes creates what the heart most desires to see. These visions are not supernatural visitations, but rather the natural response of souls struggling to accept God's will. His explanations were reasonable, compassionate, and completely wrong. The truth was far more systematic and infinitely more cruel. What had actually happened to James Morrison was this. On January 15, 1868, Morrison had reported to Dr. Whitman, complaining of severe chest pains and difficulty breathing. These symptoms were common among miners, often indicating the onset of pneumoconiosis, the black lung disease that eventually claimed most men who worked the coalface. Whitman examined Morrison thoroughly, then delivered devastating news. Morrison was dying. The disease had progressed too far for treatment. He had perhaps weeks to live, certainly no more than months. Morrison was a 34-year-old man with a wife and 3 young children. His life insurance policy through Thompson's program would provide $500, barely enough to cover his medical care, let alone support his family after his death. In his desperation, Morrison made a decision that would condemn him to a fate worse than the disease ravaging his lungs. Dr. Whitman had presented him with an alternative. "There is another way," Whitman had said quietly, after ensuring his office door was locked. "A way your family could receive the insurance money immediately, while you address your situation through other means." The proposal was elegantly simple and utterly damning. Morrison would be declared dead of acute heart failure, a common enough cause among miners that no one would question it. His body would be prepared for burial by Crow, his funeral would be conducted by Thompson, and his family would receive their insurance payout within days. Morrison himself would be transported to work in the deep mines of western Pennsylvania, where labor was desperately needed and questions weren't asked. He could work until his disease claimed him naturally, knowing his family was provided for. "You're dying anyway," Whitman had explained with clinical detachment. "This way, your death serves a purpose, your family benefits, and you contribute to the industrial progress of our great state. It's a Christian solution to an unfortunate situation." Morrison, faced with the choice between leaving his family destitute or enduring a few years of hard labor while knowing they were secure, chose what seemed like sacrifice. He had no way of knowing he was choosing slavery. The conspiracy was breathtakingly comprehensive. Thompson provided the religious and administrative framework, creating trust within the community and handling insurance paperwork. Dr. Whitman identified suitable candidates and provided false death certificates that would pass any cursory examination. Crow prepared weighted coffins and conducted convincing burial ceremonies. And a network of labor contractors transported the deceased to remote mining operations where they worked under assumed names until their real deaths occurred. But Morrison's appearance walking the railroad tracks had been no coincidence. He wasn't a free laborer heading to a new job. He was a prisoner being transported in chains, part of a human cargo bound for the hellish conditions of the anthracite mines near Centralia, where industrial accidents and cave-ins killed workers faster than they could be replaced. The men who operated these mines didn't care about the workers' real names or backgrounds. They paid Thompson and his associates a flat fee for each able-bodied laborer delivered. No questions asked. The workers themselves received nothing beyond minimal food and shelter. They were slaves in everything but name, and most would never see their families again. This was the beginning of what would become known as the Millbrook Method, a systematic process of converting the desperate into the disappeared, transforming tragedy into profit, and turning a house of God into a marketplace for human souls. The success of Thompson's first venture with James Morrison established a template that would be refined and expanded over the following years. What had begun as an opportunistic arrangement with a single dying miner evolved into a sophisticated operation that preyed on the vulnerabilities of an entire community. Thompson's genius lay in his understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. He never approached healthy, prosperous families. Instead, he focused on those already facing medical or financial crises, men diagnosed with progressive illnesses, families drowning in debt, workers injured in mine accidents who could no longer earn their wages. To these desperate souls, he offered what appeared to be miraculous salvation: immediate financial relief through early insurance payouts in exchange for temporary sacrifice. Dr. Whitman became increasingly skilled at identifying suitable candidates. His medical practice gave him intimate knowledge of which families were facing medical bankruptcies, which workers were developing signs of black lung disease, and which injuries would leave men unable to continue mining. He began requesting regular health examinations for all church members enrolled in the insurance program, a service presented as preventive care but actually functioning as a screening process for potential victims. Prevention is the cornerstone of good health. Whitman would announce at church health seminars, early detection saves lives and protects families from unexpected hardship. The examinations were thorough and professional, building trust while gathering intelligence. Whitman documented not just medical conditions, but also family financial situations, debt loads, and social connections. Men with large families and limited social networks were particularly vulnerable. They had the greatest incentive to consider drastic measures and the fewest people who might notice their absence. Samuel Crowe, meanwhile, perfected the art of simulated death. His background as both undertaker and sexton gave him unique expertise in the practical aspects of death and burial. He developed techniques for creating convincing corpses using sawdust, rags, and stones arranged to approximate human weight and dimensions. The coffins were sealed immediately after viewing, with explanations about rapid decomposition or infectious disease, making extended wakes inadvisable. In cases of lung disease, Crowe would explain to grieving families, the body deteriorates quickly after death. For the health and comfort of the bereaved, immediate sealing is recommended. The funeral services themselves were elaborate and emotionally overwhelming, designed to prevent close scrutiny of the proceedings. Thompson's sermons were particularly powerful during these occasions, focusing on themes of sacrifice, redemption, and the mysterious ways of divine providence. The emotional intensity of these services left families drained and grateful, not suspicious. Between 1868 and 1870, 12 more men were processed through this system. Each case followed the same pattern: terminal diagnosis or devastating injury, consultation with Dr. Whitman, private meeting with Reverend Thompson, staged death, elaborate funeral, immediate insurance payout, and transportation to remote mining operations. The victims were typically men in their 30s and 40s, old enough to have substantial family responsibilities, but young enough to provide years of hard labor. They came from different backgrounds. Within the Protestant community, Welsh miners, German railroad workers, Irish farmers who'd turned to mining after crop failures. What they shared was desperation and the belief that they were making a noble sacrifice for their families. None of them realized they were being sold into slavery. The mining operations that purchased these men were concentrated in the remote areas of western Pennsylvania, where the demand for expendable labor was enormous and regulation was minimal. These weren't the established mining companies with safety protocols and worker protections. They were illegal or quasi-legal operations that extracted coal from dangerous, unstable deposits using methods that legitimate companies had abandoned as too risky. Workers in these operations faced conditions that made normal mining seem safe by comparison. They worked 12 to 16-hour shifts in poorly ventilated tunnels, used outdated equipment that frequently malfunctioned, and lived in overcrowded barracks with inadequate food and medical care. Death rates were astronomical, but the operators didn't care. Replacement workers could always be obtained through contacts like Thompson. The men who survived more than a few months in these conditions became shells of their former selves. The combination of extreme physical labor, poor nutrition, constant danger, and complete isolation from their families broke their spirits as effectively as the work broke their bodies. Even if they had somehow escaped, they faced the impossible task of explaining their return from the dead to families who had mourned them and collected insurance money based on their demise. This psychological trap was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire system. The victims became complicit in their own enslavement, unable to reveal the truth without destroying the families they had supposedly died to protect. By 1870, Thompson's operation had generated over $6,500 in insurance payouts, a fortune by contemporary standards. More importantly, it had established him as one of the most trusted and beloved figures in Millbrook. His church membership had grown dramatically, drawn by his practical approach to family security and his genuine apparent concern for his congregation's welfare. The Keystone Mutual Assurance Company, far from being suspicious of the high death rate among St. Stephen's policyholders, was actually pleased with the arrangement. Thompson's prompt submission of documentation and the lack of disputed claims made Millbrook one of their most profitable markets. They even began recommending Thompson's methods to other agents as an example of effective customer service. But the system's very success would ultimately lead to its expansion and its eventual exposure. Thompson had created something too profitable to remain small, too successful to avoid attracting attention, and too dependent on human misery to continue indefinitely without consequences. The shadows of the past were about to give way to the darkest chapter of the conspiracy, as Thompson prepared to scale his operation to levels that would ultimately doom it. What had begun with one desperate miner would soon encompass entire families, and the Methodist approach of individual salvation would evolve into something resembling wholesale slaughter. The question that would haunt investigators for decades was not whether Thompson and his associates were criminals. That would become undeniably clear. The question was whether they had convinced themselves they were doing God's work, or whether they had simply discovered that evil, when dressed in religious clothing and presented with compassionate rhetoric, could flourish in plain sight within a community desperate enough to believe in miracles. The transformation of Thompson's operation from opportunistic crime to systematic atrocity began in the spring of 1871, when he received an unexpected visitor that would change everything. Colonel Harrison Blackwood arrived in Millbrook on a Thursday morning, stepping off the Pennsylvania Railroad wearing an expensive suit and carrying leather satchels that suggested serious business. Blackwood was a veteran of the Civil War who had transitioned into industrial ventures, specifically the operation of mining concerns in the most remote and dangerous locations throughout Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. What Blackwood offered Thompson was a dramatically expanded market for his unique services. "Reverend Thompson," Blackwood explained during their private meeting in the church office, "I represent a consortium of mining operations that have been impressed by your innovative approach to labor acquisition. We have immediate need for 500 able-bodied workers, and we're prepared to pay premium rates for rapid delivery." The math was staggering. At $75 per worker, triple Thompson's previous rate, this single contract would generate $37,500, more than most ministers earned in a lifetime. But Blackwood's proposal went far beyond simple expansion of existing methods. We're not just interested in the dying and desperate, Blackwood continued. We need healthy workers who can contribute for years, not months. We're prepared to offer family packages, situations where entire households can benefit from relocation with generous compensation for wives and children. Thompson understood immediately what Blackwood was suggesting. Instead of targeting only terminal cases, they would begin recruiting healthy workers under false pretenses, promising profitable employment in distant locations while actually delivering them into slavery. Families would receive insurance payouts for accidental deaths that never occurred, while the workers themselves disappeared into the industrial hell of illegal mining operations. Dr. Whitman was initially reluctant to participate in this expansion. Falsifying death certificates for legitimately ill patients was one thing. Those men were likely to die anyway, and their families did benefit from early insurance payments. But deliberately targeting healthy workers crossed a line that made him deeply uncomfortable. Marcus, Whitman confided during one of their private consultations, what we've been doing serves a purpose. We've helped families in desperate situations, provided for widows and orphans who would otherwise face destitution. But this is something else entirely. Thompson's response revealed the complete moral transformation that had occurred over the previous 4 years. Cornelius, you're thinking too narrowly, Thompson replied, his voice carrying the same pastoral authority he used in sermons. These men will work productively for years, contributing to the industrial strength of our nation while providing security for their families. Instead of wasting away in these played-out mines, watching their lungs slowly fill with coal dust, they'll be building America's future in new territories. It's not cruelty. It's opportunity. The Reverend had become expert at reframing slavery as salvation, presenting the complete destruction of families as family protection. His ability to justify the unjustifiable through religious rhetoric had evolved into something approaching genuine delusion, or perhaps something far worse than delusion. Samuel Crow required no convincing. The undertaker had profited substantially from the conspiracy and had developed a taste for the work that went beyond mere financial motivation. He began suggesting refinements to their methods, ways to make the process more efficient and less likely to attract attention. We need to vary our approach, Crow recommended. Too many deaths from the same causes might eventually draw questions. I can arrange mining accidents, house fires, even drownings. Each method requires different preparation, but the results are equally effective. The first family to be processed under the expanded system was the Hendersons, Robert, his wife Sarah, and their 2 teenage sons, Michael and James. Robert was a skilled carpenter who had been struggling to find steady work as mine construction slowed. When Thompson approached him with an offer of lucrative employment building mining infrastructure in Colorado, with immediate advance payment to help the family prepare for relocation, Robert saw it as an answer to prayer. The arrangement seemed generous and legitimate. Robert would travel ahead to establish housing and employment, while Sarah and the boys followed a few months later. To help with expenses, Thompson arranged for Robert to purchase a substantial life insurance policy, with the understanding that it could be converted to family coverage once they were established in Colorado. What actually happened was that Robert was declared dead in a mining accident 2 weeks after his supposed departure. Sarah received a $1,000 insurance payout and a detailed account of her husband's tragic death in a tunnel collapse. She was told that his body had been too badly damaged for return to Pennsylvania, but that he had been given a proper Christian burial by local authorities. 3 months later, Sarah and her sons were approached with a similar offer. Thompson explained that Robert had made arrangements before his death for his family to join him in Colorado, working with associates who would honor his wishes. The insurance money would cover their travel expenses, and profitable employment awaited them at their destination. Sarah, grieving and trusting the minister who had provided such comfort during her loss, agreed to the arrangement. She and her sons were given train tickets to what they believed was Colorado, but were actually transported to mining operations in remote areas of West Virginia, where they joined Robert in conditions that resembled nothing so much as a prison camp. The Henderson case established the template for what would become known as family processing, a method that eliminated potential witnesses while maximizing both insurance profits and labor yields. Between 1871 and 1875, Thompson processed 43 complete families through this system, generating over $85,000 in insurance payments while delivering nearly 200 workers to Blackwood's consortium. But this expansion brought new risks and complications. Unlike the original victims, who were already facing death or disability, the family processing system created victims who were healthy, connected to the community, and likely to be missed. Thompson needed new methods to explain their disappearances and prevent investigation. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. He began spreading stories of religious revival movements in the Western Territories, communities of faithful Christians who were establishing new settlements based on biblical principles. Families who joined these movements necessarily severed ties with their previous communities, dedicating themselves completely to their new spiritual calling. "The Lord is calling His people to new lands," Thompson announced from his pulpit, just as He called Abraham from Ur, Moses from Egypt, the disciples from their nets. Some among us have heard this calling and chosen to answer, to sacrifice the comfort of familiar surroundings for the greater glory of establishing God's kingdom in the wilderness. This religious framework provided perfect cover for family disappearances. When the Hendersons and other families vanished, community members assumed they had joined religious settlements and chosen to cut contact with their previous lives. It was unusual, but not unprecedented. Religious enthusiasm often led to dramatic lifestyle changes, and the idea of Christian communities in frontier territories was entirely plausible. Thompson even arranged for occasional letters to be sent to Millbrook, supposedly from families who had successfully established themselves in these new communities. The letters, actually written by associates in distant cities, described successful farming ventures, growing religious communities, and deep satisfaction with their new lives. These communications reinforced the cover story while discouraging further inquiry. By 1875, Thompson's operation had evolved into something unprecedented in American criminal history. A systematic program of family destruction disguised as religious ministry, operating with the full trust and support of its victim community. The conspiracy had processed over 120 people, generated more than $150,000 in fraudulent insurance payments, and created a network of forced labor camps that stretched across 3 states. But the very scale of this success was creating problems that would prove impossible to resolve. The high death and disappearance rate among St. Stephen's congregation was beginning to attract attention from church authorities, insurance investigators, and law enforcement agencies. More critically, some of the original victims had survived long enough in the labor camps to begin planning escapes, and their intimate knowledge of Thompson's methods made them extremely dangerous to the entire operation. The shadows of the past were about to collide with the realities of the present, and the collision would expose secrets that had been buried deeper than any of the empty coffins in St. Stephen's Cemetery. Just when we thought we understood the scope of Reverend Thompson's operation, we discover it was far more extensive and horrifying than anyone imagined. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our investigation of these forgotten crimes, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories that uncover the truth about America's hidden history. Now let's see how this web of deception began to unravel. The beginning of the end came from the last person anyone would have suspected: Rebecca Morrison, the widow of James Morrison. the first victim of Thompson's conspiracy 7 years earlier. Rebecca had been one of Thompson's greatest success stories. After receiving her husband's insurance money in 1868, she had used it to open a small boarding house that catered to traveling salesmen and mining supervisors. The business prospered, and Rebecca became one of Millbrook's most respected widows, a testament to Thompson's program and the financial security it provided to bereaved families. But Rebecca Morrison was also one of the few people in Millbrook who read newspapers from other cities. In October of 1875, while reviewing a Philadelphia paper left by one of her boarders, Rebecca noticed a small article about labor conditions in the anthracite mines near Centralia. The piece mentioned a mine accident that had killed 15 workers, including several men whose backgrounds suggested they weren't typical miners. What caught Rebecca's attention was one name mentioned in the casualty list: James Morrison, age 38. Originally from the Schuylkill region. The age was wrong. Her James would have been 41 by 1875, but the name and regional origin created an impossible coincidence. How could there be another James Morrison from the same area working in the same industry who had died in a mine accident? Rebecca began collecting newspapers from other cities, searching for any mention of mining accidents, labor disputes, or unusual deaths. What she discovered over the following months created a pattern that chilled her to the bone. Names kept appearing. Not just variations or coincidences, but exact matches. Thomas McKenna, who had supposedly died of black lung in 1869, Patrick O'Sullivan, officially deceased from a mining accident in 1870, Benjamin Fletcher, heart attack victim in 1871. The newspaper accounts described them as active workers who had died in various industrial accidents between 1872 and 1875, years after their official deaths and elaborate funerals in Millbrook. Rebecca faced an impossible situation. Either multiple men in Pennsylvania shared identical names with recently deceased members of her community, or the men she had mourned were still alive, or at least had been alive for years after their supposed deaths. Her first instinct was to approach Reverend Thompson with her discoveries, seeking his guidance and comfort in understanding what seemed like impossible coincidences. But something made her hesitate. Perhaps it was a subtle memory of Thompson's quick, almost too smooth explanations for previous strange occurrences. Perhaps it was the way he had immediately discouraged discussion when other community members reported seeing their deceased relatives in neighboring towns. Instead, Rebecca decided to conduct her own investigation. Using her boarding house as a base of operations, Rebecca began corresponding with newspapers, coroners, and mining authorities in the regions where deceased Millbrook residents had supposedly died in industrial accidents. Her questions were carefully framed as those of a grieving community member seeking to understand the tragic pattern of accidents affecting men from her area. The responses she received painted a picture that defied every assumption about death, burial, and community trust. According to mining records, James Morrison had been employed by the Centralia Deep Coal Company from March 1868 until his death in October 1875. A period that began just 2 months after his funeral in Millbrook. Employment records described him as a skilled miner who had been brought in as part of a group of workers recruited from eastern Pennsylvania. He had lived in company housing, received company pay, and had been buried in the company cemetery after his death in a tunnel collapse. The same pattern emerged for other names. Men who had been mourned and buried in Millbrook had actually been working in remote mining operations for years after their supposed deaths. They had been employed under their real names, suggesting they weren't hiding their identities. They had received wages, lived in company housing, and interacted with other workers who knew them as living people, not as escapees from death. This revelation forced a terrible conclusion. Either the entire concept of death had somehow become unreliable, or the men buried in St. Stephen's Cemetery weren't actually buried there at all. Rebecca made a decision that would ultimately expose the entire conspiracy. On a cold November night in 1875, she recruited her brother-in-law, Daniel Walsh, and two trusted neighbors to help her investigate one of the graves. They chose James Morrison's grave, partly because Rebecca felt she had the right to know the truth about her husband, but mostly because his burial site was relatively isolated in the newer section of the cemetery. The four conspirators worked by lamplight, taking turns with shovels, expecting to find either human remains or evidence of desecration. What they found was a coffin full of stones and sawdust, carefully arranged to approximate the weight and dimensions of a human body. The discovery was devastating in its implications, but it also created a new problem. Rebecca and her associates now possessed evidence of a crime, but they had obtained it through illegal means. Disturbing a grave was a serious offense, and their investigation could result in their own prosecution. More importantly, they had no way of knowing how extensive the conspiracy might be or who else might be involved. If Reverend Thompson was part of the deception, who else might be complicit? Dr. Whitman had signed the death certificates. Samuel Crowe had prepared the bodies and conducted the burials. Were local authorities involved? Insurance investigators? How deep did the corruption extend? Rebecca made the decision to document her findings before approaching any official authorities. Over the following weeks, she and her associates secretly examined 6 more graves, finding the same evidence in each case. Coffins filled with stones, weighted to feel like human bodies, but containing no human remains. Meanwhile, Thompson was beginning to sense that his operation faced new risks. The expansion into family processing had created logistical challenges and increased the number of people who possessed dangerous knowledge. Some of the families processed through his system had extended relatives in other communities who asked uncomfortable questions about their sudden departure and subsequent silence. More troubling were reports from Blackwood's consortium about problems in the labor camps. Several original victims had survived longer than expected and were beginning to organize resistance among the workers. Some escape attempts had been successful, and escaped workers possessed intimate knowledge of Thompson's recruitment methods and the false deaths that had enabled their enslavement. Thompson began making preparations for what he privately called operational conclusion, the systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses that would allow him to relocate and establish similar operations in other communities. This preparation included plans for dealing with potentially problematic community members who might have discovered too much about his activities. Rebecca Morrison had no way of knowing that her investigation had attracted Thompson's attention, or that her name had been added to a list of people who posed unacceptable risks to the conspiracy's continued operation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether the truth about St. Stephen's Church would be exposed or buried forever along with its witnesses. Rebecca held evidence that could destroy Thompson's operation, but Thompson held power over an entire community and resources that could easily eliminate a troublesome widow. The question was not whether they would clash, but whether anyone would survive to tell the story of what happened when they did. The confrontation began on a grey December morning in 1875, when Rebecca Morrison made the mistake of trusting the wrong person with her terrible discoveries. She had decided to approach Dr. Whitman first, believing that his medical training and professional ethics would make him a reliable ally in exposing the conspiracy. Rebecca reasoned that if Whitman had been deceived into signing false death certificates, he would want to correct the record and prevent further crimes. If he was complicit, her approach would force him to reveal himself, but she believed she could manage that risk. She was catastrophically wrong about both assessments. When Rebecca presented her evidence to Dr. Whitman in his office, showing him the photographs she had taken of the opened graves and the documentation she had gathered about deceased miners working in other locations, Whitman's reaction was immediate and chilling. "Mrs. Morrison, he said quietly. "You have made a very serious mistake coming here." Within hours, Rebecca found herself confronting not just Dr. Whitman's betrayal, but the full extent of the conspiracy that had been operating around her for 7 years. Thompson arrived at Whitman's office accompanied by Samuel Crowe and 2 men Rebecca didn't recognize, rough-looking individuals who clearly weren't from Millbrook. "Rebecca," Thompson said, his pastoral voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "You've discovered something that puts not just you but your entire community at risk. The work we've been doing here serves a greater purpose than you understand. The men you think we've wronged have contributed to industrial progress that benefits the entire nation. The families who received insurance payments have been saved from destitution. What seems like deception to you is actually a form of divine providence working through human agency." Thompson's attempt to justify the conspiracy through religious rhetoric revealed the complete moral corruption that had transformed him from minister to monster. But Rebecca Morrison was no longer the grieving widow who had accepted his comfort 7 years earlier. She had become something far more dangerous to the conspiracy, an informed and determined adversary. "You're not serving God," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "You're serving yourself. You've turned our church into a slaughterhouse, our community into a hunting ground, and our faith into a marketplace for human souls. James is dead now. Really dead. And so are all the others. They died as slaves in your minds, far from their families, believing they had sacrificed themselves for a noble purpose. You've committed murder, Reverend Thompson. Mass murder, disguised as ministry." The accusation hit its target with devastating accuracy. Thompson's carefully constructed theological justifications crumbled under the weight of simple truth. For a moment, the mask of pastoral concern slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "What you call murder, Mrs. Morrison, has provided security for dozens of families and productive labor for expanding industries. These men would have died anyway, in our played-out minds, from black lung disease, from industrial accidents. We simply redirected their deaths to serve a useful purpose." Dr. Whitman stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "Rebecca, you're clearly distraught. The evidence you think you found can be explained through rational means. Grave robbing is a serious crime, and the stress of conducting such activities has obviously affected your mental state. I'm going to give you something to help you rest, and then we can discuss how to address this situation properly." But Rebecca had anticipated this possibility. Before coming to Whitman's office, she had left detailed documentation with her brother-in-law, Daniel Walsh, along with instructions to contact authorities in Philadelphia if she didn't return by evening. She had also sent copies of her evidence to the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Pennsylvania State Police, though she hadn't mentioned this precaution to anyone in Millbrook. "Dr. Whitman," Rebecca said, backing toward the office door, "if you approach me with that bag, you'll be committing assault in front of witnesses. And gentlemen, if anything happens to me today, detailed evidence of your conspiracy will be in the hands of state authorities by tomorrow morning." The revelation that Rebecca had taken precautions beyond their immediate control changed the dynamic completely. Thompson and his associates faced a choice between immediate violence that would certainly expose them and allowing Rebecca to leave with knowledge that might expose them eventually. Thompson chose a middle path that would prove to be his final mistake. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, "you're acting on incomplete information. Yes, we have been creative in our methods of helping families in crisis. But you don't understand the full scope of what we've accomplished. Would you be willing to see the complete picture before making final judgments? Would you visit one of our operations, speak with the men you think are victims, see for yourself how they live and work?" It was a trap, of course. Thompson was offering Rebecca the chance to visit one of Blackwood's mining operations, where she would, accidentally suffer a fatal accident that would eliminate her as a threat while providing a plausible explanation for her death. But Rebecca had spent months studying Thompson's methods, and she recognized the pattern. "I'll consider your offer," she replied carefully, "but only if you agree to my conditions. I want to visit these operations accompanied by independent witnesses, perhaps representatives from the State Mining Authority or the Philadelphia newspapers. I want advance notice of exactly where we're going and when. And I want guarantees about communication with outside authorities during the visit." These conditions made Thompson's trap impossible to execute, but they also revealed that Rebecca understood exactly what he had been proposing. The pretense of peaceful resolution evaporated, leaving only the stark reality of what would happen next. Samuel Crowe spoke for the first time during the confrontation, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone accustomed to death. "She knows too much, and she's prepared too well. This ends one of two ways. She disappears tonight, or we all hang next month." The blunt assessment forced everyone in the room to confront the full implications of their situation. Thompson's conspiracy had grown too large to contain and too documented to deny. Rebecca Morrison possessed evidence that could destroy them all, and her precautions made it impossible to silence her without confirming her accusations. But Thompson had spent 7 years building his operation, generating enormous profits, and convincing himself that his crime served a higher purpose. He wasn't prepared to surrender everything because one woman had discovered the truth. "Mrs. Morrison," Thompson said finally, "I want you to understand something. The men in this room have committed themselves completely to our mission. We've moved beyond the point where retreat is possible. If our work is exposed, dozens of families will lose the insurance payments that have sustained them for years. Hundreds of workers will be abandoned in mining operations where they have no legal status or protection. The economic disruption alone will destroy this community." It was a desperate attempt at moral blackmail, suggesting that exposing the conspiracy would harm the very people it had victimized. But Rebecca had anticipated this argument as well. "Reverend Thompson," she replied, "you're describing the consequences of your crimes, not reasons to continue committing them. Those families received money stolen through insurance fraud. Those workers are slaves who deserve rescue, not abandonment. And this community deserves the truth about what's been done in the name of Christian charity." The exchange marked the end of negotiation and the beginning of what Thompson would later describe in his private journals as operational termination, the systematic elimination of threats to prevent exposure of the conspiracy. But Rebecca Morrison had made one final preparation that Thompson couldn't have anticipated. As she spoke her last words in Dr. Whitman's office, 2 Pennsylvania State Police investigators were already on a train to Millbrook, summoned by the evidence she had mailed to Harrisburg 3 days earlier. They would arrive that evening, armed with warrants and accompanied by federal marshals who had been investigating reports of forced labor in remote mining operations. The confrontation in Dr. Whitman's office was interrupted by the sound of horses and carriages arriving outside. Sounds that would mark the beginning of the largest criminal investigation in Pennsylvania's history and the end of Thompson's reign over St. Stephen's Church. What happened next would expose not just the scope of Thompson's conspiracy, but the horrifying conditions in the labor camps where his victims had been imprisoned, and the network of corruption that had allowed such systematic evil to flourish under the protection of religious authority. The arrest of Reverend Marcus Thompson, Dr. Cornelius Whitman, and Samuel Crowe on December 15, 1875, marked the beginning of an investigation that would ultimately expose the largest human trafficking operation in American history to that date. Pennsylvania State Police Captain William McReady, who led the initial investigation, would later write in his official report, "In 23 years of law enforcement, I have never encountered crimes of such scope and systematic cruelty. The conspiracy operated with the efficiency of a business enterprise and the moral authority of religious ministry, creating a perfect storm of exploitation that claimed at least 157 documented victims. The investigation revealed details that shocked even experienced law enforcement officials. Thompson's private journals, discovered in a hidden compartment of his church office, contained meticulous records of every victim processed through his system. Each entry included the person's real name, their fictional cause of death, the insurance payout received, and their ultimate destination in Blackwood's network of forced labor operations. More disturbing were Thompson's theological justifications for each crime, written in the same hand that had prepared Sunday sermons. He had convinced himself that he was conducting a form of divine selection, identifying those whose deaths could serve a greater purpose, and arranging for that purpose to be fulfilled. His journal entries revealed a man who had gradually lost all distinction between religious calling and criminal enterprise. Dr. Whitman's medical records provided evidence of the systematic identification and targeting of victims. His patient files contained detailed assessments not just of medical conditions, but of family financial situations, social connections, and psychological vulnerabilities. Marginal notes in his handwriting included calculations of insurance values and assessments of each patient's potential productivity as forced labor. Samuel Crow's workshop yielded the most physically disturbing evidence. Investigators found detailed instructions for creating convincing corpses using sawdust, rags, and stones, along with tools and materials for sealing coffins immediately after viewing. They also discovered correspondence with suppliers who provided materials for these fake burials, revealing that the deception had required ongoing purchases of specialized equipment. The investigation of Blackwood's mining operations required coordination between state authorities in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. What they discovered was a network of illegal and quasi-legal mining concerns that operated under conditions resembling antebellum slavery. Workers were housed in overcrowded barracks, fed minimal rations, worked shifts of 12 to 16 hours, and received no wages beyond basic subsistence. Most shocking was the discovery that many of Thompson's victims were still alive when the investigation began. Rescue operations at 14 different mining sites freed 87 survivors, though most were in such poor physical and psychological condition that they required months of medical care before they could testify about their experiences. The survivor testimonies painted a picture of systematic psychological torture designed to prevent escape and resistance. Workers were told that their families believed them dead and had moved on with their lives. They were informed that returning home would result in insurance fraud charges that would imprison both them and their families. They were deliberately isolated from other workers to prevent the formation of supportive relationships or organized resistance. James Morrison, Rebecca's husband and Thompson's first victim, was among the survivors rescued from a mining operation near Centralia. He had been working in forced labor for 7 years and 11 months when investigators found him. His reunion with Rebecca became one of the most documented and emotionally powerful moments of the entire investigation, symbolizing both the horror of Thompson's crimes and the possibility of justice and recovery. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented in their scope and complexity. Thompson, Whitman, Crow, and 37 associates were charged with crimes ranging from insurance fraud and kidnapping to involuntary servitude and conspiracy to commit murder. The trials required testimony from over 200 witnesses and the examination of thousands of documents spanning nearly a decade. Thompson's defense team attempted to argue that their client had genuinely believed he was helping families in crisis, and that the conditions in the mining operations were beyond his control or knowledge. This strategy collapsed when prosecutors presented Thompson's private journals, which clearly documented his awareness of the true conditions and his active participation in maintaining them. The most damning evidence came from Thompson's own words, written in his journal after visiting one of the mining operations in 1874. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, transforming what appears to be suffering into divine purpose. These men sacrifice their earthly comfort so that their families may prosper and industry may advance. Their temporary hardship serves eternal purposes that they cannot comprehend but must trust in faith." Dr. Whitman attempted to claim that he had been deceived by Thompson and had believed he was participating in a legitimate insurance program. This defense was undermined by evidence showing that he had personally visited mining operations, examined working conditions, and recommended changes to improve worker productivity rather than worker welfare. Samuel Crowe offered no defense beyond claiming he had followed orders and assumed others understood the legal implications of their actions. His cooperation with prosecutors, including detailed explanations of his methods for creating fake corpses and staging convincing funerals, secured him a reduced sentence, but also provided some of the most disturbing testimony in the entire proceedings. The trials concluded in October of 1876 with convictions on virtually all charges. Thompson was sentenced to life imprisonment at Eastern State Penitentiary, where he died in 1891, still maintaining in his final letters that he had been conducting God's work through unconventional means. Whitman received 25 years and served 18 before his death from consumption in 1894. Crowe was sentenced to 15 years and was released in 1889, after which he disappeared from historical records. The investigation's impact extended far beyond the prosecution of individual criminals. It led to significant reforms in insurance regulation, including requirements for independent verification of deaths and mandatory waiting periods before benefit payments. It also resulted in new federal legislation regarding working conditions in mining operations and the prosecution of forced labor arrangements. For the community of Millbrook, the revelation of Thompson's conspiracy created trauma that lasted for generations. Families who had mourned loved ones discovered that their grief had been manipulated for profit. Community members who had trusted Thompson's guidance realized they had been living under the authority of a criminal enterprise disguised as religious ministry. The psychological impact was particularly severe for families who had received insurance payments based on false deaths. Many felt compelled to return money they had spent on homes, businesses, and children's education, even though they had been victims rather than participants in the fraud. The moral complexity of their situation, having benefited financially from crimes they had not known were being committed, created guilt and shame that affected the community for decades. St. Stephen's Church itself never recovered from the scandal. Attendance dropped to fewer than 30 members by 1877, and the building was sold to the Catholic diocese in 1879. The cemetery remained under community control, but many families relocated the graves of legitimately deceased relatives to other burial grounds, unable to distinguish between real and fake burials without expensive exhumations. Rebecca Morrison became something of a national figure, celebrated in newspapers across the country as the brave widow who exposed one of America's most heinous criminal conspiracies. She used her newfound prominence to advocate for insurance reform and support for trafficking victims, speaking at conferences and meeting with legislators until her death in 1923. The empty coffins of St. Stephen's Church became a symbol of how evil could flourish under the protection of religious authority and community trust. The case study was used in law enforcement training for decades, demonstrating how criminals could exploit social institutions and human vulnerabilities to conduct systematic atrocities in plain sight. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that Thompson's operation had been entirely preventable. Multiple people had reported seeing deceased individuals in neighboring communities, but these reports had been dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations rather than investigated as potential evidence of crime. The authority granted to religious figures and medical professionals had created an environment where their word was rarely questioned, even when evidence suggested serious problems. The final tally of Thompson's conspiracy was staggering: 157 documented victims, $847,000 in fraudulent insurance payments, equivalent to over $20 million today, and a network of forced labor operations that had enslaved hundreds of workers across multiple states. The human cost was incalculable, families destroyed, communities traumatized, and faith in religious authority permanently damaged. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire case was Thompson's final statement before sentencing, delivered without apparent remorse or recognition of his crime's true nature. "I have served God's purpose in ways that others cannot understand. The men who worked in those mines contributed to America's industrial progress. The families who received insurance payments were saved from destitution. The efficiency of our methods allowed us to help more people than traditional charity could ever reach. History will vindicate the necessity of what we accomplished." This statement revealed that Thompson had never truly understood the evil of his actions. He had created a theological framework that transformed slavery into salvation, murder into ministry, and systematic exploitation into divine service. His ability to maintain these delusions, even after exposure and conviction, demonstrated the dangerous power of ideological justification to corrupt moral reasoning. The story of St. Stephen's Church and its empty coffins serves as a permanent reminder that the greatest evils often wear the mask of greatest good, that authority without accountability breeds corruption, and that the price of community trust must never be the abandonment of individual vigilance. Rebecca Morrison's courage in investigating the impossible and confronting the unthinkable prevented Thompson's conspiracy from claiming additional victims and ensured that the truth, however horrible, would not remain buried with its evidence. This mystery shows us that evil can flourish in the most unexpected places, protected by the very institutions meant to safeguard human dignity and spiritual welfare. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that communities today are better protected against such systematic deception? Or could similar conspiracies still operate under the cover of religious or charitable authority? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling and want to hear more stories about America's hidden criminal history, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of uncovering buried truths. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones that powerful people hoped would never be told.